The Arab Spring. In the 2010s, the Arab Spring was a series of popular uprisings and protests that began in Tunisia in December 2010 and spread to other countries in the Arab world, including Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. The uprisings were sparked by a variety of factors, including political repression, economic inequality, and a lack of political freedoms. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia on December 17, 2010, when a young street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in protest of police harassment and corruption. His death sparked widespread protests and demonstrations against the government of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Within a month, Ben Ali had been forced to flee the country, and a new government was established. The events in Tunisia inspired similar protests and uprisings in other countries in the Arab world. In Egypt, protests against President Hosni Mubarak began on January 25, 2011. The protests were sparked by widespread anger over poverty, unemployment, and political repression. The protests quickly grew in size and intensity, and on February 11, 2011, Mubarak resigned from office. In Libya, protests against the government of Muammar Gaddafi began on February 15, 2011. The protests quickly turned into a civil war, with opposition forces receiving support from the international community, including NATO. In August 2011, opposition forces captured the capital, Tripoli, and Gaddafi was killed in October. In Syria, protests against the government of President Bashar al-Assad began on March 15, 2011. The government responded to the protests with brutal force, and the country descended into a civil war. The war has been ongoing for more than a decade and has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. In Bahrain, protests began on February 14, 2011, and were met with a violent crackdown by the government. The protests were led by the country's majority Shia population, who were demanding political and economic reforms and an end to discrimination. In Yemen, protests against President Ali Abdullah Saleh began on January 27, 2011. The protests were sparked by widespread anger over poverty, unemployment, and political repression. Saleh was forced to step down in 2012 and was succeeded by his deputy, Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi. The Arab Spring had a significant impact on the countries affected by the uprisings. In Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, the protests led to the overthrow of longtime dictators and the establishment of new governments. However, the transition to democracy in these countries has been difficult and marked by political instability and economic challenges. In Syria, the civil war has caused a humanitarian catastrophe, with hundreds of thousands of people killed and millions displaced. The war has also led to the rise of extremist groups such as ISIS. In Bahrain, the government's crackdown on the protests has led to increased repression and human rights abuses. In Yemen, the civil war has led to widespread suffering and a humanitarian crisis. The Arab Spring also had a significant impact on the region and the world. The uprisings led to a shift in the balance of power in the Middle East, with the fall of longtime dictators and the emergence of new governments and political movements. The Arab Spring also led to a greater focus on democracy and human rights in the region and the world. In conclusion, the Arab Spring was a series of popular uprisings and protests that began in Tunisia in December 2010 and spread to other countries in the Arab world. The uprisings were sparked by a variety of factors, including political repression, economic inequality, and a lack of political freedoms. The Arab Spring had a significant impact on the countries affected by the uprisings, leading to the overthrow of longtime dictators and the establishment of new governments.